Welcome back to another episode of the Beyond the Blueprint podcast, powered by Lippolis Electric. I'm your host, Stephen Marcellino Jr., Vice President of Sales with Lippolis Electric. And for those of you that do not know, Lippolis Electric has been in business for 40 years. We are a family-owned business, and we take care of sectors of the electrical construction industry such as residential services, emergency services, energy efficiency services, commercial services, and technical services / engineered service. And today, I have the pleasure of sitting with David Goldoff, the president of Camelot Realty. David, how are you today?
I'm great, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem at all. So, David, I want to jump right in and kind of talk, bring it back to, the early days of your professional career and kind of where you started. So I know you have a heavy influence from your father in the real estate industry. I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit and talk about that influence that your father had on you for breaking into the industry, and then, kind of where you're at today, and, just give us the story of who David Goldoff is.
Oh, okay. That might take a long time. Hopefully not.
It's all about you today, buddy.
Thanks for having me. Well, I wasn't involved with real estate for a long time, actually. I did advertising for a while, and I went to art school, actually, where I met my wife. And, I was going to be an artist. I liked doing graffiti back in the day.
Oh, very cool.
Port Chester was one of my hot spots.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. I got into that field for at least 5 years, where I was doing a lot of web design and advertising, marketing. And I was working for these companies that were like brand new. Everything was going on to the web, and you wanted to have your brand on the web. And all of a sudden, the technology wasn't really up to speed where the market was. So if you wanted to buy something online, or if you wanted to showcase like a podcast or a video, the technology wasn't there. So you couldn't, you'd have to have something really choppy. I'm older, so it was like dial-ups. You're waiting for this AOL little box to turn on, and I wasn't having it. So these companies came and went. And my dad originally sold corporate life insurance. And
Oh, wow.
And it was back in the day where they would take someone's urine or blood samples, and he would hold them in our refrigerator. And if I tried to figure out where the food was, I had to make sure I didn't pick up someone else's vial of something or another. So it was a little messy. It was a little messy back then. But one day I'm in the city. I'm living in a building that they owned, my uncle and father, and I was down in the Seaport. And I left my job, and I couldn't pay the rent. And my uncle called me over. My uncle was the real estate guy. My dad was more of a finance guy and a golfer. So he made a lot of his business on the golf course.
Golf is very important in business.
Yeah, it really is. A lot of deals could be made on the golf course.
100%.
And my uncle basically told me, this is what we do. You should try it. You like this stuff. You're creative. You've got a personality, a little bit of an attitude. You could do this. And I said to myself, do I want to be a slumlord? I was just teasing. But they said to me, no, this is something that you could try. And it's creative. You could build something. So, he said to me, we're landlords. We collect rent. We have to pay our bills. And hopefully at the end of the day, we have enough money to do something with it, and take care of our families. It was a family business. And so we worked on this first building in the Seaport together, 257 Water Street. And it was an old loft building, 20 apartments, 2 restaurants, and a cell phone site on the roof. And I lived in there. And so I needed money, and I wanted to continue doing stuff. So I said, let me try this. I've been doing advertising for 4 years prior to that. So I said, I'm creative. I can, I did a lot of websites. So I would work with creative people and accounting people. So I knew how to work with budgets, and I knew how to find assets, find creative people, put something together on a board as far as a mock-up board, and then execute a plan. So I said, let me do that with an apartment. I talked to my uncle, and I said, give me a shot and let me fix up an apartment. And he said, okay, there's this 2-bedroom loft that we've been getting $1,800 for. It was 2,200 square feet, had a backyard space, but it had no view. It was kind of a dark space. So I go in there and I look at it, and they had these old, hi-hats and Formica countertops and really crappy flooring, and everything was just old.
Yeah.
Dark.
Needed a little bit of a facelift.
Musty.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm around 21 years old, and I like to go out and have a good time, and it was just this is garbage, right? So I said, I'm going to take all this out. So what did I do? I basically went to like IKEA and Home Depot and all these places, and I started walking around looking at like, what do I want to put into something? What would I want? And I just started figuring out I want this, I want that. He gave me his credit card. I spent like 50 grand in like a week. He flipped out. He's a twin. So my father and uncle are identical twins.
Yeah.
So he had daughters, and he used to say to me, like, you're my son. So I used to have two dads, right? One say left, the other one say right. They were very tough old Jewish guys from Brooklyn, and he freaked out. And he told my dad he's never allowed back here again. Tell him to give my card back. And my father said, let him finish. So he has something planned for you. I didn't know what I was doing. I hired a contractor, I think out of like some online Craigslist thing or whatever it was. And I found somebody I liked, and we worked on it. And I didn't really show him what I was planning on doing, because I didn't realize that like you kind of have to work with people from the beginning to the end. It's a visual business that we're in, but at the same time, it's hard to explain that you want a certain wall a certain way, or the light's going to look a certain, until you actually have something to show.
Correct. Yeah.
So I said, just be patient. Let me show you what I'm going to do. So I changed out the entire kitchen. I put in brand new white cabinets with glass and stainless steel appliances, and granite countertops, and put in nice oak floors. And
What year was this?
This is probably around 2021, 2020, and it was really nice. And then they said, well, what do you think we can rent it for? I said, let me try to rent it. I didn't have a license, but you can rent apartments for your family. You don't need a license for that. So I went out and I put ads out, and I rented it out for about $3,800 a month.
Wow.
So, it was more than double than what they were making.
Wow,
and they said, how did you do that? And I said, well, I'm young, you're old. And I said, I put in what I wanted to put in, and I liked that. And I liked being able to show what I did. It was almost like building a website when I was in advertising from start to finish. But I knew that I made a lot of mistakes, and I probably spent more than I should have, and I really didn't understand like construction. I didn't understand basically, how material is delivered and time, and I didn't get any permits, which was a no-no. But back then you could kind of do that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I just sort of pushed the envelope, and I just wherever the cards would land, I would deal with it. He liked it. He said, do it again. I started doing it more and more. And it was a 20-unit building. So I was able to, like, over a period of time, renovate almost all the units as they would come up, rent it, and I raised their income a lot.
That's awesome.
And I really, like, loved it. I got really into that stuff.
And with that, you were able to use the creative side of your brain as well, and kind of design these apartments from like a design build perspective and bring a vision to life, which I'm sure having that more creative, artistic side of you makes doing this job more fun when you're able to kind of bring a vision to life, I would guess.
100%, because you always want to, it's a challenge. If you look at something, that what else could it be? If I want to move a wall, add some better lighting, or I want to put in like some cool tile, just give it some character. It's always nice when you can sort of flip things a little bit, and I like that. So for me, that's always going to be an interesting part of it, and I like to look at things differently, definitely. Otherwise, it could just get dull and boring. You don't want that. You want to have some interesting pieces of what you do every day. That was part of it. And they let me, have free range, which was very rare. I didn't really have a 9-to-5 boss or sort of setting where, you're given certain tasks and this is what your job is. They were just said, let them run with it, which was a blessing. Like I never had that. I always came from a place where here's the project, here's the budget, here's the timeline, this is what you got to do. And people would check in on you, and you have to report to somebody like a job, like anything else. But this was completely like two old guys who said, let him do what he wants to do. And, I like to talk to people. I like to go and tour apartments. I like to show things. So I eventually got my license, became a broker. And that was like, I was working within, their realm. They had a building in the West Village, one in Soho, and one in the Seaport. So I worked there for about 5 years doing that sort of stuff, and then eventually just started managing. I broke a lot of stuff. I pissed off a lot of people, maybe caused a couple leaks here and there. But you break some eggs, you create an omelet, that sort of thing. And but that gave me the free range to really learn things. Like I really wanted to get in and learn construction, learn development, learn marketing, and how things are, can look better after a before and after, create a track record, that sort of stuff.
That's awesome. So from the beginning, from your beginning in the industry to current date, you're managing about, 130 plus buildings, and you've delivered 26% IRR on, some of your deals. So what's like your secret to kind of being successful in this real estate / property management realm?
It's like what we've been talking about. You have to get really creative. Back when we were doing a lot of projects that involved value add, I'm not a ground up type of guy. I don't do things from the ground up. I liked sales. I would go and inspect, let's say, other people's work and see what other people were doing. I like art, so I would go check out what artists were doing. And I lived in Lower Manhattan, so for me at the time, just being around things that were changing so fast, and seeing the city and what people like, it's a visual world. So you really have to be able to go into a place and say, this would be so much cooler if it had this, or if we could build on the top and add, an extra room and duplex it, or if we can change these windows or expose this brick or whatever it was, like, how much is that worth? And that's the game. I mean, I think you really have to figure out value add as a game of, for every dollar you spend, can you get $2 back? And that's very tricky. There's a lot of things that go into figuring that out, which is, sometimes you hit it, sometimes you don't. But you can't hit a home run every time you put your money into something. But if you can hit a single or a double, you start building a track record. When you do hit those home runs, people take notice, you gain trust, you create that track record, you pay back people their money, you keep going on to the next one. So it takes time. And the same thing with, with management. You have to sort of be able to service people. Once you get the place finished, the relationship continues, because in the management world, you're servicing people's expectations. You got to be there for them. Things break, there's maintenance. So it's like a whole process. I was able to really do that within my family's buildings in the beginning, and then eventually they introduced me to other people, and they allowed me to, I got a license, I went to school for it, and graduated with a degree for it, and I really got into it. So it was my life. You make a lot of mistakes, and, you have to figure those sort of things out. Today, you build pro formas, you build in projections based on comps, and data is everywhere. Back then, data wasn't so widely spread like it is today, so you were allowed to walk around and make assumptions, and rates in the market were a lot more favorable, so that made it easier to borrow and leverage. And it takes time to put this stuff together. So a lot of it has to do with, by the time I have an idea and I want to execute it, and I close and I actually put together my plan and execute it properly, you don't realize that sometimes, like, construction delays, or the city of New York decides to, like, not show up, and all of a sudden you're like, but we planned all this, and then you have to figure that into your budget. And sometimes supplies disappear, or you're fighting with your contractor. So there's a whole lot of variables, and it's risky, because you can get caught and then you can get hurt, or sometimes you get lucky, and it really is timing. So a lot of this has to do with just doing it over and over repetitively until you find a rhythm, and try to take minimal risk, because you've learned from the past. When you're a kid and you burn yourself, right, you're not going to touch that hot iron, or you're going to touch that hot pan or whatever. But you try to remember those things. I think that helps a lot too. But the returns are based on projections and into a pro forma that we create beforehand when we're buying something, and we're value add types of operators. So we come in. Maybe we take an apartment and we combine two spaces into one, or maybe we can cut up the place more and add another bedroom, upgrade the amenities, the kitchens, the bathrooms, things like that. More visual stuff. Maybe we're putting laundry in the basement, adding a pop-up on the roof to add a duplex. Those sort of stuff. Virtual doormans are very popular. Amenities.
So you guys, it sounds like you go into a property when you take it over, or you start managing it, and figure out where you could increase the value of the property more or less, and make it more visually appealing to get people that want to rent or potentially buy in these buildings, when maybe a few months before you being involved, they would not have even looked twice at that same building.
Yeah. And then, the neighborhoods change too. So as you're, looking at where the future is and what areas are being gentrified. You take Brooklyn, for example, parts of Brooklyn today, Bushwick, would you
Crazy.
ever really hang out in Bushwick back in the day? Probably not, for a lot of reasons, or, maybe you did go there for other reasons. But today, it's more or less, a hot spot. Greenpoint is like
Williamsburg.
amazing. Williamsburg. Yeah, so all these areas 10, 15 years ago weren't like that,
No.
but they were gems because you find these giant spaces with these cool characteristics, and you're like, I can make something really nice here, really cool. It's going to stick out. But then everyone was all about, I want to be in Manhattan. But Manhattan just became so expensive. So people are going out to Sunnyside now, they're going out to Flatbush, they're going out to Greenpoint, they're going out to all these other areas that, only 10 years ago, nobody even knew what they were,
Correct,
and then
yeah.
trying to get investors to back you on that sort of stuff, unless you told an investor, hey, it's in Times Square, or it's by some sort of massive landmark. It was like
They didn't think twice about it.
no, it was like a deer in the headlights. They didn't know what you were talking about.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time taking my dad and uncle in the beginning to look at some of these areas like Williamsburg before it was really hot, or parts of Queens like Sunnyside, and
Yeah.
they weren't into it because it's a different generation. So you got to find people that see your vision, understand what you're trying to do, and that takes time because you got to build a track record for that. Lower East Side's a great spot. We cater to college kids. So post-college and college, a lot of shared apartments. We don't do high-end. We're not doing low-end. And it's been great. It wasn't so great when COVID hit because they sent all the kids home and we almost lost our shirts. But then once they came back in, the market, really, really jumped because the city really is, at the end of the day, it's a young person's environment. You got great restaurants and bars. A lot of people aren't cooking, especially when they're in college. And, mom and dad are usually guaranteeing things, so it's not really coming out of their end.
Yep.
So you can get a lot of price premium for that. And in certain areas where, it's close to the subways, close to their schools, close to where the entertainment and services are, those are the areas we target.
Yeah, that's important. And I know too, because we do a lot of construction, and I service a lot of clients on the property management side, for day-to-day electrical services, or some of the different preventative maintenance programs that we put out there. A lot of Surf Avenue in Brooklyn, out in Coney Island, and like you said, Greenpoint. And what a lot of these developers are doing, I don't know how they're pulling it off, but they're striking deals with New York City, specifically like the properties on the water, where they're getting ferry access, that the ferry literally comes to the building and they create a ferry port. So these people, like you mentioned, everybody wanted to live in Manhattan, but Manhattan's became so pricey over the past, decade to live in. The more younger professionals, the college students, the families that want that city, feel, but can't afford to live directly in the city. These developers and property management companies are getting extremely creative on finding ways to get people to and from Manhattan as fast as possible to make their property, seem more appealing. So I always found that to be really interesting. You go to the building, and I looked outside, and they, the commuters, if you're there at like 8 a.m., they have the ferry picking up, hundreds of businessmen and women, going into work, and they add that as an amenity to the building, which I think is a really cool idea.
Yeah, there's a whole market for it.
Yeah.
And the city, and the developers and the ferry operators, for instance, they're all with the same goal, that they want to, move people, obviously, because it only increases the value of where you are.
Yeah.
And the neighborhood. So it's more of a macro and micro type of benefit for both sides. It started off with like city bikes. There's a program. It was a private entity until city got involved and sponsored it. But you could actually ask the city to say, look, I want to, put city bikes in front of my building. And that's a great amenity because people would ride bikes everywhere.
Yeah.
Or then it became with that group ride, which was the electrical bikes. So the city's always trying to come up with new ways to take cars out of the picture. And so, congestive pricing is now the biggest,
That's the
discussion in the city.
In all honesty, I know a lot of people are frustrated by it, but the congestion pricing has significantly freed up traveling around Manhattan. So someone like me that, doesn't necessarily want to get on a train because I'm going to multiple places in a day, and I like to just, shoot up the West Side Highway at the end of the day. The congestion pricing has been pretty helpful for me. So, I'll probably get the horns from some people on saying that, but it's true. The city does need to stay kind of creative and innovative on how they're freeing up congestion and moving. I mean, at any given time, there's 9 million people in New York City between residents and tourists. So, in New York City, yeah, it's big, but 9 million people is a lot of people.
It's a lot of people,
So,
and it's also the fact that if you own a car in the city, finding parking on the street level is
miserable.
It's insane.
Yeah.
I had a car. I still have the same truck, and living in the city for that, you're paying a real price if you're putting in parking. It's almost like someone else's rent.
Yeah.
And so you have to get creative with all these other sort of places to move around in, and it's a game. The city, it's not easy. They took a lane away out of the Brooklyn Bridge and they added a bike path and all that sort of stuff, and that's great. But at the same time, now you've just congested more traffic, and Park Avenue and certain areas of Broadway in the summertime are closed down so people can use it as through festivals or a food thing, whatever. And it's great, but then there's sacrifices. You can't find parking, so. It depends. If you're the guy coming in from the city, out from the city into the city, then, you're going to have your reasons why, and that might trickle down to the customer because they have to sort of make up for that, increased price for congested pricing. But at the same time, I get it from the perspective of the city. They want to have more freedom for people to walk around and less cars. But at the end of the day, I think that, if you're living in the city in the age group that we're targeting, they don't own cars.
None of them do.
They rent cars for the weekend, or the summertime. They're going to go, to the beach, or they're going to go to the mountains, or they're going to go to, out of the state for the weekend, or, it's a necessity because maybe they're visiting family, but nobody really owns cars. And so,
not anymore.
No, you don't need to. It's like anything else. Everything is basically leased to go, on demand. So that's sort of how you got to think as like an operator. Things have to be on demand. You want to have a package come in. You don't need a doorman or a concierge anymore for certain buildings. You have package rooms, you have a storage cage, you have virtual doormans that could see and let people in virtually by remote. So it's changing everything. It's more fluid. You don't have to have humans involved. So, but at the same time, I'm a big advocate for doing, having the right talent plus prop tech, the right technology to help service people and keep costs low, because you're reducing labor at the end of the day is what all these things are doing. You're trying to automate as much as you can. You're trying to create, change inefficiencies to efficiencies. And you want the tenant or the resident, the owner or a renter to be feel that they don't want to leave here. This is their community. This is their habitat. You want them to stay, And I think in the past, maybe it wasn't the same. People were just trying to max out dollars as much as they can. But I still think that today, if you try to retain people and residents, you can't make everybody happy every day, and I'm not striving to say that you should, but at the same time, you want to be able to create an experience and a habitat that people are going to enjoy. You can't, put, as my dad used to say, you can't put lipstick on a pig, but you have to provide some sort of, brand and, build something that's going to last to some degree, that people are going to remember. People name buildings now. They brand buildings now. They want to stand out. They're putting really high-end finishes that are almost for like a condo and a rental. That wasn't the case back in the day.
And that's kind of what, especially with like the younger generation, my generation, when they are looking to buy in the city or rent in the city, they're looking for the experience, like you just said. They're not looking just for like an apartment. They want the gym amenities. They want to know, does my building have an arcade in it and a steam room and, all these different types of, comfort, amenities, so to speak, for the lifestyle, opposed to just, having a nice apartment in Manhattan. They want to buy that whole New York City experience as a package.
We've rented and sold apartments to people that come around with brokers that just FaceTime the whole place to a buyer somewhere else. People are paying in Bitcoin. People want to see where they can have a social media area where they can have a TikTok or some sort of live podcast or live stream something from a common area. These are all things that, as an operator, you can either care or not. I'm not saying you have to do every whistle and bell and chase every little shiny thing that's coming out.
Yeah.
But you have to recognize that stuff and adopt it to some degree, because if you don't, it's a very competitive game. There's so many people now in this game. It's crazy. And like what I mean by that is that It's a good thing because it pushes innovation and it pushes competition, which I enjoy. But at the same time, you really have to step up your game to stand out because there's just every walk of life. I meet people all the time that want to do what I do or are curious or maybe do it on a smaller level or flip apartments or flip a house. You still have to stand out. You have to create a brand, curb appeal.
100%. When you're putting this experience together for people, how important are like good subcontractors to you and your business, when doing this type of work?
It's everything. I've had the experience and the pleasure of working with developers that are building these really high-end boutique buildings. And, the devil's in the details. Someone said to me, a really high-end broker said to me once, Frederick Eklund from $1 Million Listing Show, we used to do a lot of projects together. And I'm not name dropping or anything, but that we all worked for the same developer. And he said to me, I sell the dreams, David, and you deal with the nightmares. And that always stuck with me because it looks beautiful on the outside, but new construction is the worst thing you could ever buy. You want to try to buy something that maybe, is like a year old because it has to settle. It has to go through, being run for the first time and being used. A lot of times these things break or they don't work right or they weren't connected right or something. And the next thing you know, the excitement of my home is brand new and I'm so happy to be here. It turns into who am I suing? Who am I going after for this? And who am I, and then the subs usually disappear within the next couple of years or they change, companies and things like that. So it becomes a little litigious in New York City. But I think you can't avoid, construction's a mess. You're building something from scratch. Everything's custom. You hope that the trades are going to do the right thing and not shortcut things and, like cut corners and things like that. It happens, and you got to be able to deal with it. You got to be able to deal with people's expectations and the homeowners that get mad. And, you have to sort of just take a deep breath. It's not personal and then do the right thing. Because if you don't and you let it escalate and it just snowballs out of effect, it just becomes a lot of time wasted. And you're dealing with just people that are mad all the time. So nobody really wants that.
No, nobody wants that. And I tell people all the time, because I'm, different industry, but my day-to-day is dealing with, gentlemen like yourself in that kind of post-construction world of, property management, facility management, all that type of good stuff. And when I deal with chief engineers or property managers that are, stepping into managing a brand new building, and they say to me, oh, it's brand new, I don't need to do my testing yet, let's wait until next year. I always tell them, I've dealt with buildings where post-construction, we find more deficiencies than a building that's been owned for the past 10 years because those more aged buildings, so to speak, have already worked out the kinks. So it's really important, like what you just said, to make sure in that first year you're really auditing your building and making sure everything is operating properly. So when people do start moving in and, whether it's retail tenants or, homeowners, whatever it may be, everybody's happy with living in, your building, so to speak.
You got to do it head on. So, we have a checklist of stuff before we're going to release something to the public. If it's a rental or if it's a sale, it's still the same checklist. Yep. You got to check the elevator because there's construction dust. You have to test the boiler for, if it's going to run right, the HVAC. You're going to change those filters because they've been clogged up with so much dust. The drain lines, the contractors and subs, they'll dump plaster and other stuff down the drain. You got to snake those things. There's all these preventive things that you got to do. You got to test the sensors so that if something does burst or leak, something's shut off now. It's a lot, but you do it so that you don't have to deal with headaches at the end of the day. My whole life, I built a whole business literally on dealing with other people's headaches. And in the beginning, I said to myself, what am I doing? My friends used to be like, why do you do this? Right?
Why do you put yourself through this?
Right? I went gray for a while, and I still, I don't dye my hair or anything, but I'm just like, as soon as it just fall out.
You embrace it. That's a good sale right there.
I meet these old managers.
You got the scars to prove it.
These old property managers, and it takes a lot out of you. Some of these guys are drooling, walking around like a zombie because it just took so much out of them. So I don't want to be like that.
No.
I don't want to be like a used car salesman. I have pride in what I want to put out there, and I want people to remember that. So I really enjoy the fact that I know it's a lot of legwork and time, but you have to make sure that these things are working properly. You're never going to catch everything.
Nope.
It's impossible.
It's physically impossible.
But, you also got to let people know that, you're not walking away from something either. But you also have to set expectations with people so that you're not just chasing everything that they're going to want changed. Because if you give someone an inch, they're going to take a mile. So, there is a limit and cap on certain things. But it's really, look, with social media and people that can post and put things out to the world, now you're more accountable. And so the city of New York has really weaponized renters. If you go on any type of social media site today and you type in, how do I get free rent? Or how do I become rent stabilized? Or how do I go after my landlord?
There's a lot of literature.
There's 1,000 feeds for all types of stuff. YouTube, this, that, whatever.
It's crazy.
It is crazy. It's not right. I think that there should be, things that promote good building and good standards.
I agree.
But that's not the world we're in. There's more voters that are renters and owners than there are landlords and developers. So there's always that side of it that you got to remember too. But I try to tell people when they call in, they're complaining about something that, it's going to be taken care of. And, we have systems now in place and staff and supers and maintenance guys and subs. And you try to build relationships with guys that, also enjoy doing what they do and, like to see a good product put out, electrician, plumber, elevator guy, sprinkler. You build a book of business on a roster of contractors and subs that you can rely on because those are the lifeblood of the buildings.
True.
And if you don't have that and you don't care, and you're just there for a quick buck, people recognize that real fast.
Yeah, and your turnover rate's going to be insane.
And then you're going to be hiding.
Yeah.
We have a couple clients back in the day who built garbage. And now you can't find their social media, no more lunch and going out anymore. They're they're hiding right now. You can't.
Yeah, you can't go through life like an armadillo just rolling around.
But some guys flying. You have a lot of foreigners that come into the city too.
Yeah.
They develop crap because they're just in and out. But that doesn't last very long.
And they're just looking to bury their money in American assets. That's all they want to do in that scenario, anyways.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, David, because we're going to start winding down, but I want to make sure the listeners can hear what to expect from you. What is the next step for David Goldoff and Camelot Realty?
Scale. I've been doing mid-sized buildings for a long time, small buildings. I really like the idea of how the market has changed for me in the sense that with technology and money, how fast it could be transferred, and technology, how quickly some things could be adoptable. It's brought down the cost of how you can manage a property. You can refine your businesses. Automation is everywhere. AI is everywhere now. It's involved in everything that everyone does, and it's just making things so much more efficient. So it's allowing me to take a step back for a minute and be like, hey, how can I do that to be better at what I do with my business? And then how can I do that again and again and adopt that into other businesses that I might want to get involved with? Maybe I want to partner with somebody. Maybe I want to buy one of these businesses. I want to become a revenue junkie. I want to go after other companies, not in a very territorial way, but I believe that there's a lot of other management companies that I think that have been set in their ways for a really long time that really no one's really heard of. And maybe they're out in areas that people don't always go to. I think that's an untapped market. I think that there's nuggets there, little gold nuggets that I think that I'd love to collect. But I like to also go after much bigger buildings because they have the money and they have antiquated systems. It's all going to be about systems, saving money and costs, and being able to produce a product that's efficient and everything's being automated. So if I can do all that and create the best systems that work for me, I want to take that to the next level by sharing that with other people and grow together.
Very nice. That's awesome. And anybody that's, looking to connect with David or, hear more about the business, you can find him on Instagram at David Goldoff or, at Camelot Realty. And before we end it today, David, why don't you throw a quick tip out there for, the younger generation that may be looking to break into the real estate investment market, property management market, so they could start off on the right foot instead of, making some mistakes.
Listen to your parents, become a doctor, become a banker. Don't do any of this stuff. Stay away from everything. Do what you're told. Put your head down. No, the reality is you gotta take risks.
Yeah.
This is not a 9-to-5 job. You got to be able to have a tough skin, and you got to be able to step from what everyone else is doing, even though it might look really cool and seem like it's making a lot of money. Don't just assume just because everyone else is doing it that it's going to work for you, and investigate everything as much as you can, but take those risks. Don't get yourself in credit card debt and leverage yourself, maxing yourself out, and don't promise the world things that you can't deliver. Just find someone you could work with that you think maybe knows what they're doing. Shadow that person, mentor, find a mentor. Find people that, have done it and could give you experiences, but all this stuff you can't learn in school. You got to do it, and you got to go out, and you have to be able to get a lot of disappointments, fail a lot.
Failure makes the best winners, in my opinion. That's a motto I've always lived by.
Or leave the city and do something else and become a librarian. I don't know. Uber
Listen,
driver.
David, I appreciate you coming
Pleasure.
out today.
Good to see you, Steve.
This was a very valuable episode, and I'm sure everybody that's going to listen to this is going to really enjoy everything you had to say today. So with that, I want to thank all the listeners for viewing in to another episode of the Beyond the Blueprint podcast, powered by Lippolis Electric. I'm your host, Stephen Marcellino Jr. Have a great day.